The invitation came with a smile attached to it. Anthony Hopkins had been on late-night television enough times to recognize the tone before the words were even finished. Relaxed, teasing, safe. This wasn't an interview meant to probe or unsettle. It was meant to charm. The host was known for that, known for warmth, known for mischief disguised as kindness. The studio audience applauded as Hopkins walked out, measured and unhurried, dressed simply, offering a small wave that felt more polite than performative. He shook the host's hand, exchanged a brief greeting, and took a seat. They spoke first about the obvious things. Films, awards, longevity, the strange business of still being relevant after decades in an industry that discards people quickly. Hopkins answered thoughtfully, with humor that never asked for approval. The host leaned back in a chair, smiling. "You know," he said, "people always talk about your intensity." Hopkins tilted his head. "Do they?" "Oh yes," the host laughed. "The focus, the stare, the menace when you need it." The audience chuckled. But the host continued, "I've heard you're full of surprises." Hopkins smiled faintly. "That depends who's asking." The host tapped his desk lightly. "I heard," he said, lowering his voice theatrically, "that you play the piano." The audience murmured. Not impressed. Curious. Hopkins nodded once. "Do." The host grinned. "Classical, among other things," Hopkins replied. The host raised his eyebrows and turned to the audience. "Well," he said, "we do have a piano." Laughter rippled through the studio. Hopkins didn't respond immediately. This was the moment where most guests would deflect. Make a joke. Claim rust. Promise to do it another time. The host leaned forward. "Would you?" he asked. "Just a few notes. For fun." The word fun carried the implication. Light. Harmless. A novelty. Hopkins studied the host for a second longer than expected. "Is it tuned?" he asked. The audience laughed again. The host waved a hand. "Close enough." Hopkins nodded. "All right," he said. There was a subtle shift in the room. Not excitement yet. Something quieter. Attention rearranging itself. Hopkins stood and walked toward the piano at the side of the stage. Not theatrically. No beat it up. No acknowledgement of applause. He sat, adjusted the bench slightly, and then, before touching the keys, he closed his eyes. That was when the laughter stopped. Not abruptly. Gradually. As if the audience had sensed, collectively, that this wasn't going to be what they thought. Hopkins rested his hands on the keys. Stillness. The host leaned back, expecting a flourish. A joke chord. Something ironic. Instead, Hopkins began softly. Not loud. Not fast. A simple progression. Clean. Controlled. The sound filled the studio in a way no one had prepared for. Not impressive yet, but intentional. The host's smile faltered slightly. Hopkins continued. The melody unfolded patiently. Not showy. Not designed to provoke applause. Each note placed with care, as if he were alone in a room that rewarded listening. The audience grew silent. Studio technicians froze at their stations. Hopkins' posture never changed. His face remained composed, almost distant. Not because he was disengaged, but because he was deeply present. Then he shifted. The melody deepened. Harmonies layered themselves naturally, without excess. This wasn't a stunt. This was someone fluent in restraint. The host's expression changed completely. He stopped watching the audience. Stopped playing to the camera. His eyes stayed fixed on Hopkins' hands. Hopkins played as if time had widened. As if the clock governing television no longer applied. The piece wasn't long, but it was complete. When Hopkins finished, he didn't hold the final note theatrically. He let it go. Silence followed. Not awkward. Full. The audience didn't applaud immediately. They waited, as if clapping would interrupt something still happening inside them. That applause came. Not cheers. Respect. Hopkins stood, nodded once, and returned to his seat. The host cleared his throat. "Well," he said, voice quieter now, "I wasn't expecting that." Hopkins smiled faintly. "Most people aren't." The host laughed, but sounded different now. Less confident. More honest. "How long have you played?" he asked. "Since I was a boy," Hopkins replied. "Off and on." "And you never mention it?" the host said. Hopkins shrugged lightly. "It's not something I use," he said. "It's something I keep." The host nodded, blinking more than usual. The interview continued, but it had shifted permanently. Questions became slower, more careful. The host stopped trying to steer the moment. At one point, he looked down at his notes, then pushed them aside. "You know," he said, "I was joking when I asked you to play." Hopkins met his eyes. "I know," he said. The host smiled weakly. "I won't do that again." Hopkins smiled back, not unkindly. "You can," he said. "Just don't assume." The audience laughed softly, unsure whether to. As the show moved toward its end, the host turned to the camera. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "Anthony Hopkins." The applause rose again, sustained. Hopkins stood, waved briefly, and exited. Backstage, the host sat alone for a moment after the cameras cut. He rubbed his eyes. A producer approached. "You okay?" The host nodded. "Yeah," then paused. "No," he said. I think I underestimated something." The producer smiled. "Everyone does." The host exhaled slowly. "I thought it'd be a joke," he said. "A bit." The producer glanced toward the hallway Hopkins had disappeared down. "Sometimes," he said, "you don't know what you're asking for." The full weight of that realization, the quiet conversation afterward, the private apology, and the reason the host would later admit that night changed how he treated guests, hadn't surfaced yet. But something had already happened. Not humiliation, not embarrassment, a recalibration. Because Anthony Hopkins hadn't tried to impress anyone. He had simply answered a casual challenge with sincerity. And sincerity, when it arrives unannounced on live television, has a way of undoing people. The host would understand that fully a few minutes later, when cameras were gone, the laughter had faded, and he finally allowed himself to feel why his eyes were burning. Not from surprise, from recognition. The cameras were off, but the moment hadn't ended. If anything, it had just begun to settle. The studio lights dimmed slightly as the audience filed out, still talking in lowered voices, still replaying what they just witnessed. Stagehands moved quietly now, instinctively respectful, as if noise might somehow disturb the echo that still hung in the air. The host remained at his desk longer than usual. He hadn't stood immediately, hadn't cracked a joke to reset the mood. He stared down at the polished wood surface, fingers resting where his cue cards had been moments earlier. A producer approached carefully. "That was something," the producer said. The host nodded, eyes still unfocused. "Yeah. You okay?" The host inhaled, then exhaled slowly. "I didn't mean to do that." "Do what?" "Put him on the spot," the host said. "I thought it would be harmless." The producer leaned against the desk. He didn't seem bothered. "No," the host said quietly. "That's the problem." Down the hall, Anthony Hopkins walked calmly toward his dressing room. No entourage, no lingering crew, just a steady, unhurried pace, as if the evening had unfolded exactly as expected. A stage manager caught up to him. "Sir Anthony," she said, a little breathless. "That was incredible." Hopkins smiled politely. "Thank you." She hesitated. You don't usually do that, do you?" He paused at his door. "No," he said. "I usually don't." And he stepped inside. The host finally stood and followed, stopping outside Hopkins' dressing room a few minutes later. He raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. For the first time that night, he felt unsure of himself. He knocked anyway. "Come in," Hopkins said. The host entered slowly. Hopkins was already removing his jacket, movements precise, unhurried. He turned. "Yes." The host cleared his throat. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." Hopkins raised an eyebrow slightly. "For what?" "For turning into a bit," the host said. "I didn't know what I was asking you to do." Hopkins considered him. "I did," he said gently. The host laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "That's what got me." Hopkins gestured to a chair. The host sat. "I've been doing this a long time," the host said. "I pride myself on reading people, making them comfortable." Hopkins nodded. "But tonight," the host continued, "I realized I'd mistaken comfort for simplicity." Hopkins smiled faintly. "It happens." "I wasn't laughing at you," the host said quickly. "I was laughing at the idea of it." Hopkins met his eyes. "Those are often the same thing," he said. The host swallowed. "When you started playing, I don't know, something cracked." Hopkins waited. "My father used to play," the host said, "late at night, when he thought no one was listening. I hadn't thought about that in years. Hopkins nodded slowly. That's usually how it works, he said. Music doesn't ask permission. It finds what's unfinished. The host looked down at his hands. I don't cry on my own show. Hopkins smiled gently. Neither do I. They sat in silence for a moment. Then the host looked up. Why didn't you stop me? Hopkins tilted his head. Why would I? You could have said no, the host said. You could have deflected. Yes, Hopkins agreed. But that would have kept everything shallow. The host nodded. You chose depth. Hopkins corrected him. You chose honesty. The host stood a few minutes later, steadier now. Thank you, he said. Not for the performance. Hopkins smiled. You're welcome. The host hesitated at the door. You know, I'll never do that again. Not like that. Hopkins considered him. Good, he said. But don't stop being curious. The host smiled. I won't. Years later, the clip would resurface online. Not often, not loudly. But when it did, people noticed the same thing every time. Not the playing, the stillness before it. Commentators would talk about Hopkins' discipline, his hidden talents, his depth. But the host, in a rare reflective interview long after the show had ended, described it differently. I thought I was teasing him, he said. Turns out, I was inviting him. The interviewer raised an eyebrow. Inviting him to what? To be sincere, the host replied. On a stage built for jokes. He paused. And sincerity is dangerous, he added. It makes you feel things you didn't plan to. The interviewer nodded. Is that why you were emotional? The host smiled sadly. No, I was emotional because I realized how often I kept people at arm's length by pretending everything was light. Anthony Hopkins never commented on the episode publicly. When asked about music in later interviews, he brushed past it with practiced ease. It's just something I do, he said. Not something I perform. But privately, he remembered that night. Not with pride, with acceptance. Because he hadn't intended to move anyone. He hadn't intended to teach a lesson. He had simply refused to cheapen something that mattered to him. And in doing so, he had reminded an entire room, and one very seasoned host, that some talents aren't meant to be unveiled for laughs. They're meant to be respected, even when discovered unexpectedly. That was why the host cried. Not because he'd been surprised, but because, for a few unguarded minutes, the walls that made television safe had fallen away. And Anthony Hopkins, without raising his voice or seeking attention, had shown what happens when sincerity walks onto a stage built for jokes. The moment ended. The lesson didn't. And long after the applause faded, long after the studio lights went dark, that quiet performance continued to echo, not as a stunt, but as a reminder. Some jokes open doors you didn't know were there. And once they open, you don't always get to choose what comes through.